Okay, so the next session has a very welcome addition to the program. We have George with us. So the first speaker will be Enrico Palandri. Enrico is a writer, a lecturer, writer in residence at UCL London and in Venice. He's also a translator, a self-translator, I heard. And his recent work is being translated by Doug Thompson, who's here with us. And the last two books, The Other Evening and I Fratelli Minori, that will come out soon, and we don't know the English title yet, so we're very curious to find out. And Enrico will talk to us about looking for the source.
Yes, in fact, I thought, because I took some notes about what has been said, that I'll half what I was going to read and take the other half of the time to react to, and in fact, perhaps I'll start reacting. Well, one thing that came to my mind while I was listening was the reaction that Primo Levi has whilst translating Kafka, that I think is almost like another book. A book that Primo Levi doesn't write, because Primo Levi has this passion for the scientific self. He has, as you know, he studied as a chemist, and he counteracted the idealistic Italian literature always with the fact that he was a chemist. And he goes on and keeps this thing going throughout his life, writing about the Shoah, writing about his youth. He's always hitting that nail, saying, I'm a scientist, I'm not a humanist, I'm not a letterato, until he comes across translating the process by Kafka. And that is a very interesting moment, and is the one which will provoke really the writing of I Sommersi Salvati, which is his last book, and the criticism he does of Kafka looks a lot about the things that we said about translation. He says Kafka is not a good author because he can't tell apart l'oro dalla ganga, gold from murk. Being an alchemist, he says the big problem is that in translating Kafka, he realizes that there is something that, in fact, retroactively is very much true for Levi's own writing, and in fact that this pretends that he has put forth to his readers has been a tool rather than something real. The fact that in writing you can take apart the gold from the murk. And it's very interesting that he finds out this through translating, and this is why I think, in a way, their process is more a book of Levi than perhaps Se non ora quando, or even La Chiave a Stella, other books that are good, but that do not challenge him intellectually so deeply and do not involve him in reviewing his own position so thoroughly. Then I wanted to say something very quickly about the other. Thinking about something that Vedita said this morning, and talking about sex. The real problem with translating, I think, is the fact that although we're all very lonely creatures, I think, people who work at a desk, we do deal with someone else when we translate in a very particular way, because we deal with not understanding, even when you know the language, even when you know very well. And in fact, I think this is something very rich which we should be able to take also with the people who are of our own native tongue, if that makes any sense. I mean, I married a Scot, and I lived all my life with somebody who doesn't understand me, and I don't understand. Although we speak each other's language, but the problem, of course, is not a linguistic one. The problem is the fact that you have to translate all the time. What does she mean? Why? And I think that I liked this exercise throughout my life, because where I came from as a teenager, I mean, I'd like to blame the failure of my early relationships with girls to that, is that I thought I understood. I thought I understood, and that was a blank. I mean, because you then do not have to do any work. You feel that you're at home, and it's not true. Handling a relationship, talking with someone else, is always translating. And I think perhaps the consolation of translators is that at least it's clear from the beginning that nothing exists in the other language, and you have to handle that. And the third point, sorry, I'll be very, very quick. It has to do with Drakakis' presentation about intralanguage. There's something that came to my mind, something that I worked on 30 years ago, a long time ago, I mean, not perhaps, but some time ago. And it's a passage in the Bible. I don't know if you know it, where Isacco blesses, he wants to bless Esau. I don't know what is in English. Esau. And Esau is disliked by his mother. And
hairy man.
Sorry?
Hairy man.
Hairy man. And yes, exactly. And she dresses him. Esau was obviously very hairy. And she dresses Jacob, putting some sheep around his wrists and his neck to go and steal the blessing. So he goes to Isaac, that by now is almost blind, and tricks his father, is the younger brother, and the blessing says, you'll be blessed, you'll rule, you'll be the elected race, you'll be powerful over your brother and his descendants, and so on. When Esau comes home from looking after his herd, hears about this trick, and goes immediately to his father, saying, you were wrong, it wasn't me, it was Jacob who stole my place through this trick. And Isaac cannot undo his blessing. There is something radical about the words, about the poetic expression, the blessing, that cannot be undone. And that for me is very puzzling. Why is a father unable to undo his own words if he realizes that he was wrong? I mean, because he acknowledges that there was and I think this is something that we should bear in mind when we enter, when we reason about translating, and it's the fact that there is something about the word that will not be undone. I don't know if it's the original, if it's the meter, if it's the form, or if it's even deeper than that. I have no idea. But we have to, I think, have an idea and bear with us this sense. And I know it very well when I write, that there is something right and something wrong, and something that cannot be undone, something that is embarrassing, as there is in our verbal, oral communication all the time. If we say something wrong, it has been said, it has been expressed, it's there, it's on the table. It's not something that you can... And, right, these were the three things. Now, I'll just read the beginning and the end of this looking for the source. You'll miss a bit of jungle, but you'll realize that it's not much... Anyway, what is the source of any form of writing? Narratives, translations, poetry. If I use the word source in an hydrological sense, I am indeed looking for water. And I would like to start my search for the underground waterways with the image of Dr. Livingstone's Lost in Africa, looking for the springs of the Nile. Livingstone is a literary vehicle, a metaphor, something I use to try and gather meaning from some scattered materials. What one does in the act of writing, how we feel when reading, a range of practical and metaphysical concerns that accompany, precede, or come after any form of writing. Loneliness and communion with an imaginary other, a sense of being that catches itself, or on the contrary, frustrating migration through the boundaries of history, language, one's own and collective limitations. Bits and pieces one becomes accustomed to through the years, the paraphernalia of ourselves at work, from failure to sense of greatness, from objectivity and toil to intangible qualities that sometimes arise like ghosts on the page, and that may render what we do wonderful or unreadable. I use here Livingstone as a magnet for all those fragments, and I hope it will absorb some of the incoherence that it is found around one's desk. I use it to shape different textures and forms around the central theme of this quest. What is the source? Like him, I try to make my way through a jungle of meta-text, paratexts, wild plants that cover the water and feed from it, hiding its ways through the territory I try to chart. I know that my happiness, as a writer or as a human being, is in quelling my thirst, swimming in my element, being at home with words. But much of my life is undoubtedly being very unhappy. I try to make sense of my shortcomings, whether personal, political, professional, philosophical. I try to flip defeat and failure on their back. Novels have been very much this struggle to survive my own siege, to come out alive from a sense of not being. I tried to give joy and relief to people who, like me, felt isolated because they had left their own country or because their life was unhappy. Not totally unhappy, of course, but that mixture of happy and unhappy, which I think we all face. But I also made myself and others miserable because sometimes answers were not forthcoming from all my efforts. And possibly because there were no answers, and looking for some made me and my readers painfully aware of our predicament. We were all lost in the 20th century, and also before and after, blah, blah, blah. I became accustomed through my writing to a state of estrangement that I try to overcome in many ways. Theoretical thinking, like the one that I'm attempting on this occasion, as in many others, has always developed since my teens as an attempt to explain to myself and to others what was at stake, why it was so difficult living and being. I doubt my thinking ever helped. It's a sort of overgrown plant that I try to chop down and keeps reappearing. When I think about any form of writing, including translating, indeed, anyone trying to express anything, I picture this person tackling something that is very difficult to investigate because so many different elements resist the inquiry. The search feeds on the resistance to it. In this way we build loneliness. Were we able to forget all words and just smile and kiss and embrace? Like Estragon and Vladimir, let's embrace. But we can't. There are words. What did you mean? We ask. And we try to answer. We start following something that may well not be. He or she may love his real partner, children, his friends, life. But when writing needs to work on this book, or let me work, or this book will never finish. Indeed, this book will never finish. Writing novels, poetry, and essays, translating, reading. I know from practice that in the dry land of one's desk, it is the water that needs finding. Sitting down full of good intention will never be enough. A sense of self, for instance, may cloud the water, confuse psychology and poetry, make it more difficult for what needs expressing to burst through the resistance of the ego. To remain in Freudian terminology, writing is very much about freeing libido, helping it to find its way through representation of the selves, overcoming censorship and delivering good reality. Our water will feed leaves and flowers if it makes it up the trunk of the tree. Psychoanalysis is by no means the only tool to scrutinize this depth. It is just one of the machetes with which we try to clear our way. What I'm looking for, like my Livingstone, is the good water somewhere, of which there are so many traces around, but I cannot see it flowing. I must follow footprints of animals, interpret the different trees, and try to get closer, because I know that if I can find it, if I divine the course of the river, the task of writing becomes relatively easier. The real problem is the source. Sorry, I'll skip to the end. The advantage of translating a text is that in this case, we are following the traces of someone else. If we get annoyed with the author, we think the book is not so good as we thought when we accepted the job. The jungle is not of our own making. There is a definite number of pages to plow through, another couple of weeks, and we're out of it. We may indeed enjoy bringing meaning from one culture into another as if we were traveling. I think that according to the text we are translating, we come soon to realize that differences are only apparent. Languages may differ, but the depth we are tackling is the same, and although we are following Mr. Livingstone, we begin to doubt that he truly passed through the path we are following now. We start sensing that the threats the author had to survive are indeed treacherous for us too. This is why, if we eventually come at the end of it, we would love to embrace the author we have been chasing for so long and simply say, Mr. Livingstone, I presume.
Thank you very much, Enrico. If that's okay with you all, we can have the 3 papers in a row and then open the discussions to the floor and ask questions. So the second speaker would be Professor Amanda Hopkinson. Amanda is visiting professor in translation studies at Manchester University and London City University. She is also a translator from Spanish, Portuguese and French, and she writes books on Latin American culture. And today she will talk about liminal limits and frontier crossroads. Thank you.
No, she won't. It was a facetious title in the first place, and I think it's been made completely redundant because I've decided there are no limits and no crossroads anymore. And that's because it's been such a fascinating conference thus far, and all of them have dissolved. But I will try and look a little bit at the role of translator as writer, writer as translator, translator as reader, and so on. But what I wanted to do first of all was to follow your example and respond to just one thing that was said earlier. There were many, many, many interesting things said that we could all, I'm sure, respond to by the yard and by the hour. But there was one thing that has to do with time and with tenses that comes up all the time with my students. And it's because we think in different ways, and I don't know what that has to say to us as translators or even as writers, because it seems to me to completely affect our whole worldviews. And Susan Basnett was talking about an Aymara way of looking at the world, but my experience, limited though it is, with indigenous languages in Latin America is that this is common to all of them, that there is a kind of God's eye view of history in which the world unfolds not just geographically as a big map, but historically without a timeline. History is not chronology, nor is time, and everything is happening. And in a way, that's not so far. I mean, this whole conference has been much more religious with a small r, not that it usually has a big one, than perhaps most of us had anticipated in coming. But it reminds me very much of the idea on the Friday Seder that you always set a place for Elijah, because he is our collective ancestor, and we don't know when he'll come again. So it's always there, and it's always prepared, and there's food enough to share. And it's the same with the indigenous people, that their ancestors are always with them, as are the future generations. It is one continuum, but if it's in any kind of shape, it's not linear, it's circular, and everybody's gathered around the same table. So that carries over into the present. So, for example, when I was translating Rigoberta Menchú, we were talking about Nobel Prize winners. She's one of 2 I've translated. The other is José Saramago, who couldn't be a more different writer or a more anti-religious one, though he did seem to spend an awful lot of his life, certainly his writing life, in ferocious argument with religion, which always makes you feel very suspicious. Who are all these communists who have to spend their whole time arguing with this Jesus Christ they don't believe in? But anyway, Rigoberta, native language is Quiché, and she still always talked about her 17 murdered relatives in the present tense, because she bore the scars and the memories alive within her all the time. And she won the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that she did in her native Guatemala to attempt to bring about reconciliation within the country. It's one of the very few Latin American countries, apart from Bolivia, that has a majority indigenous population, loosely described as Maya, but many, many different peoples with dozens of languages between them. And there was a long period of dirty war in the 80s and 90s under successive military dictatorships when war was effectively waged by the people in the capital who were nearly all mixed race or of European extraction against the indigenous people who were largely unarmed peasants in the countryside. And her work made me think that there is something else that carries over into other European language and is certainly there in Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, which is that when you remember in the present, because when you're talking about it, you're reliving that memory. And we tend to call it the historical present when we talk about it. We don't say when I was a child. If you lapse into saying I am a child and you're visualizing the world from a child's viewpoint, then you're in the historical memory. But there is another point at which that happens in an involuntary way, even in Anglo-Saxon culture, and that's in a law court. Anyone who's done any court interpreting will know, but it happens in English as well, that people who are forced to relive traumatic experiences, and I particularly know it because the previous work I've done as a feminist, rape experiences, they go into the present tense, because in being forced to talk about it, they're being forced to relive the experience. And so what struck me about translating Rigoberta was then that she had this whole Maya tradition of time happening simultaneously and not chronologically, but she also had the trauma of losing all her immediate family and most of her extended family that was always with her. And when it came back as a memory, it was also lived in the present tense in the Spanish that she was speaking. I translated from Spanish, not from Quiche. And it's still there vestigially, even in the writing of someone as popular and populist as Isabel Allende. You know, her first book, House of the Spirits, has all the ghosts and her dead grandmother and everybody around her talking at her all the time. And they're all there living in that house. And to us, it's always very sinister, the idea of ghosts. But in a lot of cultures, including contemporary cultures and including cultures that use European languages that may not have, as Sven was saying earlier, necessarily the same framework for thinking and talking about these things, those things can still be there. So that was just one first response. I've used all my time now.
Yeah, don't worry.
Well, maybe I'll do what you did and just condense very quickly a few things that I was going to say, and perhaps continue on the same themes. And rather than quote me like you quoting Livingstone, I was looking through what a lot of other people had to say they thought they were doing when they were translating, people whose translations I very much admire. And I was very interested that for some reason it hadn't penetrated to me before that our, as it were, first biblical translation, who took the translator who took the Greek into Latin, was of course St. Jerome or St. Jeremy, who also understood how to talk to lions. Would you like to pour? I think I'm going to pour in a rude's laugh if I try to read at the same time. And he always called himself an interpreter. And I'm not sure why he did this, except that he had an interpreter. In other words, he translated into Latin from the Greek, and he describes his process as, I summon a scribe, I dictate swiftly and hastily, and then I briefly annotate in the margins of the page the sense within each main section. So he's actually dictating or interpreting as he goes along.
To
rather
himself.
than, well, to his scribe, to the person who's actually writing it down. And what's interesting too is that he quotes in praise of Terence, saying, I have judged it right, I'm saying this because we're in university at the moment, to undertake a labour useful to students, although certainly not necessary for myself. That is, I have converted the most celebrated orations of two of the most eloquent Attic orators, Aeschines and Demosthenes, which they delivered in debate against each other, not recasting them as a translator, interpres, but as an orator, keeping the same meanings, but with their forms, their figures, so to speak, in words adapted to our idiom. I have not thought it necessary to pay out one word for another in this process, but have conserved the character and the force of the language. Nor have I thought it fitting to count them out to the reader, but to weigh them out. So again, as we were talking about in terms of historical chronology. It's not being literal and counting out the minutes or the years. It's the weight of the thing. It moves into a metaphorical weight. And I love that. And there's one other thing that I'm going to quote. This is fairly arbitrary because, as you see from my notes and my pile of other suggestions, we're not going to get much further on with them. Something that struck me by a Czech poet I'd never heard of before, called Yosef Mladic, and there's just a little piece about him. He lived from 1845 to 1912, and I got this from the back of a book I've just been sent by Matthew Sweeney, who's, well, actually I was given it because I gave a lecture last month at the Palacký University in Olomouc in Moravia. And Sweeney is a poet and a translator, and we seem to have plenty of them explaining how it's done here. But what he did, which was slightly different, it says here in the very short bio at the end, he's a Czech poet, translator, and editor. And again, we could talk about editing for quite a while. He spent 2 years in the USA from 1868 to 1870, where he perfected his English. He was a significant Czech translator of Shakespeare and Longfellow, among many others. And of course, we could have mentioned earlier, of course, that, or reminded ourselves, since we all know, of course, Shakespeare, apart from the histories, stole his plots from Petrarch, and or others. And of course, the excerpt that Professor Drakakis gave us was, of course, talking about Denmark. So, I mean, we get translation coming in and out of absolutely everything. We think how horrendous to translate Shakespeare, but we don't think about the transmutation that Shakespeare was wreaking on other histories and stories that he imported. Anyway, he wrote dispatches to newspapers back home, and his exile in the New World was short-lived but significant. His contacts with African Americans and American Indians convinced him of his own Czech ethnicity, and he returned to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, determined to translate the experience of others into Czech. Later, he found solace in his own poetry, which reflected the songs and landscapes of the countryside in which he grew up. Well, the sentence which preoccupies me is the one where he becomes more Czech than the Czechs by returning to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but has also assimilated the lessons of being a native Amerindian or an African American, by which I assume he meant he had to learn his own identity within an imperial regime like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he learnt it by going, of all places, to live among the Amerindians in the 1860s, which I think is really exciting. And I won't go through my paper now, you'll be pleased to hear, but I think it suggests why I have given up on the idea of even liminal limits, by which I meant always being in the margins of whatever you're writing when you're translating. You are a writer when you're a translator, obviously, because the target language and the target page becomes the book that other people are going to read. So it's your words on the page. If you can't write, you can't be a translator. But at the same time, you're in the margins of someone else's writing. And I think that the crossroads have also turned into roundabouts, because everybody does, to some extent, seem to be doing anything, because we have the poets translating and the translators writing, and so we all go on round together. Okay, basta.
Okay, let's start with a poem. It's called The Translators. It's the only poem I've written about translating. And then I'll pick up some of the ideas within the poem in what I'm going to say. The basic figure of this is a cloud. Sometimes you see clouds drifting past a city, inventions of the sky, within which images appear, then petrify, and remain there in perpetuity. Otherwise, things shift with a certain insouciance, but keep moving. Meaning vanishes into night, into the vacant parishes of the imagination, into a non-presence that is positively terrifying. But there, the clouds still loom like statues with faces, as if one could choose to see them, suspended in imagined air. I have jumped to conclusions in my time. What else would you jump to otherwise? Look hard into the eyes of language and you see nothing, only rhyme and punctuation. I have talked to ghosts in ghost language, the solemn dead at their jabber, hearing the implied instead, the sigh of the wind at its last post. I once had a mother who used at times to speak, but now I only conjure her. We carve images into clouds so we should not starve for lack of company. We break the silence into pieces, syllables of space. We are translated into ourselves. The sky rushes at us. We observe it insouciantly, watching clouds move, looking for a face. We have seen mirrors in darkened rooms hunger for us. We have seen the dead in our streets. We have felt the dread of our faces and the shapes a face assumes in its own mirror. We owe them a shape, all those faceless ones, you and I. We should feed them before they petrify, before their clouds pack up or else escape. How do I know myself before I have created my simulacrum? How are the hungry to be fed? Listen, the sky is angry. The gods are demanding to be translated. I will start with the image of clouds. It's a faintly whimsical thing. This is an edited version of something which I gave before, which is essentially about the formality of formal poetry and what is translatable out of that. You will remember the famous exchange between Hamlet and Polonius in Act 3, Scene 2. Hamlet, do you see yonder cloud that's almost in shape like a camel? Polonius, by the mass, and 'tis like a camel indeed. Hamlet, methinks it is like a weasel. Polonius, it is backed like a weasel. Hamlet, oh, very like a whale. Very like a whale. Now, the players have performed their play in front of Claudius and Gertrude. King Claudius, having recognized himself in it, dashes off distraught. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have come to quiz Hamlet on his state of mind and to attempt a reconciliation. And finally comes Polonius, who is essentially humouring Hamlet in his possible madness. Anything you say is okay. Now, just before Rosencrantz and Guildenstern depart and Polonius appears, Hamlet talks to himself, saying, "Why, look you now, how unworthy a thing you make of me. You would play upon me. You would seem to know my stops. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery. You would sound me from my lowest note to the top of my compass. And there is much music, excellent voice in this little organ. Yet cannot you make it speak. Sblood, do you think I'm easier to be played on than a pipe? Call me what instrument you will, though you can fret me, yet you cannot play upon me." Now, this whole scene is about interpretation, I think, on 3 levels. The player's performance lends itself to a specific interpretation, especially to a specific audience. There's something vital at stake and an action to follow. The parallels are clear. This character in the play equals this character among the spectators. This action in the world of the play connotes that action in the world of the audience. The play is the thing to catch the conscience of the king. Hamlet modifies the player's play in order to achieve a particular end. The point of the play is recognition. But while we can see and interpret the player's play with relative ease, in the scene with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, we are presented with a different mechanism. Hamlet is a musical instrument that the 2 false friends would play. "You would play upon me," says Hamlet, "you would seem to know my stops," etc. Hamlet moves on from the idea of an instrument to the music itself. And there is much music, he says, excellent voice in this little organ. Here it is the nature of an identity that is at question. That identity is conceived in terms of music. Hamlet is an instrument that contains music, but the music remains secret. More of it and more excellent than the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern allow for. It may be that to a good friend, a proper friend, that music might be revealed or at least partly sounded. When it comes to Polonius's cloud, however, no clear action, no clear purpose is implied. It is in some ways a game to be played by Hamlet against Polonius, a game of guess my subjectivity. And poor, desperate Polonius just plays along. Nevertheless, the clouds are really out there and are really to be seen as they are, as clouds with a certain shape and form. And while we, or they, may dispute whether its form be interpreted as camel, weasel, or whale, it is agreed there is a hump that provides a certain minimal basis for all three interpretations. The cloud is an important game to Hamlet, but it raises an important question, particularly to a poet. Translation, a practical affair, is subject, but interpretation, a less clearly defined act, is the focus. It is not original to suggest that the act of composing is in itself a form of translation, or that listening even to the most familiar language remains an act of interpretation. But how does a translator tell the subjective from the objective, the camel from the cloud, or the wood from the trees? As a poet, I am struck by the unfixity, evanescence, constant shifting of language, the way a word changes shape from context to context, how a phrase awakens a range of associations that the next phrase modifies. That process of building phrase on phrase, rhythm on rhythm, emotion on emotion, meaning on meaning, within certain assumed physical laws of a poem, which involve lineation, meter, rhyme, punctuation, syntax, is what I think of as composition. So, the poet, according to this, begins with an idea, proceeds to a form, and launches a series of interpretations that hold the form together. This all happens in the process. In effect, he starts with a play where some things are known. He moves into to the music of voice and identity, and so creates a cloud. I'm trying to bring my metaphors together here. The cloud has a necessary form governed by physical factors that might suggest camels, weasels, whales, or any other thing, without necessarily confirmable as being a camel. The cloud is as it is for a reason that implies but can never quite offer the clear hard score of substance. Go on 5 minutes?
Yeah, don't worry, we have time.
Okay. Now, in my own poem, the central image there is of seeing faces in clouds rather than camels, weasels, etc. The poem proposes, insofar as poems propose anything, clouds like statues with faces, faces that are of vital importance. We want to look to recognize something there. We're looking for something. It's like the source. You want to find a source. You find something that matters. The face of the speaker's dead mother, in my own in this case, is there, though he knows he is only imagining her. You look into the eyes of language, says the poem, and you see nothing except punctuation and rhyme. These are arbitrary things. Eventually, the poem begins to guess that it is our own faces we are looking for when we search the clouds of language. The point of writing is to translate clouds of experience into language that matters, to create our simulacra. It's my proposition. The faces in the clouds, the poem guesses, are the only faces we actually have. We have to recognize ourselves somehow. We recognize ourselves through interpreting forms. Now, this conflates various ideas of seeing, of desiring to see, of interpreting, of translating, and of creating, and offers them as a single complex act in which, however, it still makes sense to talk of individual components. We are the hungry, says the poem at the end. The sky is angry and demanding. It is the gods there that demand translation. In other words, we experience our state of being in cloudy terms that require us to see images in them. Okay, shall I stop there?
We have a few minutes if you want to.
No, it's okay.
Perfect. So we have some time for questions. We're doing very well with time now. We are back on track. So if anyone has any question or thoughts for our speakers. Yes?
Got 2 questions. One for Professor Hopkins and the other one for the Hungarian translator. Sorry.
George.
I'm very bad with
I'm George.
names.
It's okay.
I wanted to know what do you think about gender being a female translator, translating a female author, being a female translator, translating a male author, is there a difference?
You're asking me, sorry, because you were also talking about the difficulties in translating gender from a language that doesn't gender it.
Being an author yourself, being a poet yourself, how difficult it is not to superimpose your own voice to the author's voice?
The way you tell is by reading the different translations and see whether they were different, whether it's all just one voice or with several voices. No doubt there's an element of my voice in them, but it's a voice which is in combination with a voice that is apprehended in the act of translation. So yes, I mean, it would be very difficult categorically to state that you're absent from the translation.
Perhaps not desirable.
No. No. I mean,
well, there's no such thing as a right translation or wrong translation. There are some bad translations or worse translations. But, you know, I do quite often for my students or at other events translation slams, which I may participate in or I might chair. And the only sentence that I can remember that anyone had in common in the last one was a one-word sentence that was really réellement, I think it was from French. Actuellement, I can't remember what the original language was, but otherwise every single sentence was translated differently, not incorrectly, but it was a different interpretation of the text. Conversely, I've translated a number of books with my husband, who I've known for over 30 years or something. And it was interesting, I ran, when I was director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, I ran a big event at the Edinburgh Book Festival and invited a Russian translator, Tony Briggs, to come. And he gave us a sentence from War and Peace with a crib, a literal crib of what it was about. And it was not particularly long, it was about 24 words. And we were all at liberty to rearrange them in the best possible, most Tolstoyan way, and it was about Natasha's dance, of course. And the only two people in the room that got the same sentence were sitting at the opposite end of the room to each other, and were, of course, my husband and myself. Everybody else got completely different things. So, given that, I'm finding my way back to your original question now, given that I have also translated books by both men and women with my husband, the short answer is I don't know. I don't think you have to be. I think you have to understand context as well as content and know where the person is coming from. All those arguments we've had since Susan and Andrew and Lawrence Venuti and everybody sort of raised them very early on. But I honestly can't remember any serious arguments to that effect. I think it mainly happened at an earlier stage. For example, in the choice of work, when I first started translating in the 1980s, I was approached by Women's Press, and I did a series for them, and one was an anthology of Central American women's poetry, another one was of novellas, a collection of novellas, another one was a collection of short stories, and then we started doing the novels. And obviously it was all women's writing. But of course the joke, if you want a joke, was that Women's Press, though it had a woman director, Rosalind Anarol at the time, was owned, of course, by Naim Atala, who's a man. And if you want to use the word, he'd be probably proudly to say, you know, a sexist man, you know, whatever, however you want to construct that in his relationship with women. But, I mean, he took it on as a business investment and it was doing fine then. But I did that because that was where I was coming from, that's what I wanted to do. But I don't rule out that a man could have translated feminist writers. I don't think that's impossible.
I've translated a number of books by women.
Do you think it depends on the book itself as well? Like some books can be specifically about the experience of being a woman. I don't know if there are books about the experience of being a man. Maybe there are.
There's the other 90%.
Yeah. So, how is
very specific what sex is? I mean, having a child is a woman thing.
Yes, but some women choose not to have children, and they're not less women for all that. I mean, it's
I'm not saying
yeah.
that, but I'm saying that the feeling of having a human being growing inside you for 9 months can only be really understood
But
by
do you mean
the
that's
person who experienced that. The
Surely
women
that's
who
the role of
experienced
fiction,
that.
is to kind of share that
Mhm.
experience.
There is the end of the child in time, which is about the liver,
Mm.
isn't it? By Miku, and it's all a long chapter about.
I've had 5 children. I'm not terribly happy with being biologically defined, though.
Maureen?
I just want to speak about the joys of being a woman translator of a man. And I think that I understand being in there, men go out in the middle of the night and choose whichever women he wants and so on. The tremendous freedom that I don't
What
feel
book
in
was
my own
this?
life.
Sorry.
We know.
But I would say that you don't have to experience things in your own life to understand them. Sometimes you bring a different kind of understanding because you're not, the same way that you were saying that you understood people you don't understand better than your first girlfriends. And so it's a different kind of imaginative understanding if you're the other gender.
I think to your point there that Imre Kertész makes a very good point in his novel Fiasco, where he's about to describe how he will deal with Lisa Koch, who was this terrible woman commander, one of the Auschwitz parts, and he had her lampshades made of human skin and all this kind of thing. And he said, well, I was starting to write it as an autobiography about my experience there, but I couldn't write it. And the solution was that I abstracted from Lisa Koch as a person, as a terrible person, and tried to write about what meaning she might have in a piece of writing. And then it turned out that it was not when I was writing about it as an autobiography, but as fiction. I could really give it a meaning. And he makes a conclusion, it's just a brief paragraph, he makes a conclusion that the closer you are to the experience, maybe the more prevented you are from turning it into meaningful fiction. And I think that is a very provocative point. And of course, Kertész is very provocative about how you deal with the concrete experience of the camps, because his point is that some of those who are closest to the experience are those who write most badly about it. And his point is, when you start writing about it, you're not writing about the experience, but you're writing about the meaning that this experience might have for a readership or for a culture or whatever. And I think that Translator in this context is dealing not with the experience, but with this type of writing about the experience. So again, I think that Translator about a description of a birth or the experience of the father of having been part in that child but being removed from it, which is a very particular experience too, as part of the male audience will know here. I mean, it's the writing that is translated, it's not the experience. I think that's
it's the writing that is the
Translated.
It's the writing that is translated, it's not the experience. That's when we are talking.
Nevertheless, I think there's a question here about the proprietorship of the experience, of particular experiences. I don't know the answer to your question. A book needs translating, and you think, well, somebody's got to translate it. So you, on a practical level, you do it. And then you might say the following. You might say one has an imagination. Up to a certain point, I'm constantly having to imagine being... any novelist is having to imagine being somebody else. Being a child, being an animal, being anything. You can take these things on. And the other thing I would possibly add to it is that I think to be so closely genetically defined is limiting, because I think psychologically we are complex mixtures of animus, anima, and so forth. These are not defenses of it. These are not a way of saying, yes, therefore it can be done, because we don't know. It depends on how convinced the reader is by the situation, as they come across it.
It also depends very much on the style of the book and the genre of the book. There was a book that was written in French by a man called Paul Ismail that was then submitted to the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize jury when I was on it. And it was about being a Maghrebi Arab, but it was a very oniric book and a very kind of, dreamlike, cloud-like, whatever you like kind of book. And I wasn't entirely sure about the book, but I decided it was probably because the genre wasn't really for me. But the thing I really could not forgive it was that it had mistranslated at the beginning in the French original from Melville. The first line, call me Ishmael. And they'd managed to turn it into Veuillez-vous m'appeler, which is far too polite and far, not vocative or didactic at all. And of course, it turned out that the author was not a Maghrebi Arab, but was a French, university lecturer, and the whole thing was a fake. But it's funny, that what struck me as fake was not that he wasn't really an Arab. I wasn't so bothered about that because in the sense of the book, that wasn't paramount. It wasn't a plot-driven book. What really mattered was that he couldn't get his Melville right.
Julia, you had a question.
Yes, I have a question for Enrico. And I very much enjoyed hearing your thoughts about looking for the source and inspiration for a writer being a little bit mysterious and magical. And also the metaphor of water, whether it's running in rivulets or great streams.
It's not a metaphor.
Okay. Using water. But water's ubiquitous. Can you say a little bit more about how you sift and discriminate so that you do actually arrive at something that cannot be undone?
Read the rest of the paper now.
No, I wish I could, I suppose, but I think that I know, I can tell you what I know. And in fact, perhaps I don't even know that, but I'll say it anyway. But I know that that as inquiry and search and research arises a resistance, provokes a resistance. And I think the process of writing is constantly handling these material. I think this is also to do, I think, with the previous question. The problem is that I don't know if you remember. I'm sorry. I'm getting into a hole I'm trying to get out. There is an episode described by Freud to explain what he calls the second moment of trauma, and I think writing is very much that. It talks about a woman going into a boutique to try some clothes, and she's disturbed. And Freud says it's because, as a young woman, she was touched by one of the attendees in the shop, and therefore she. And it's a very nice story for Freud, is that you have the original trauma and then the symptom in adulthood. What I think is the source, what I'm doesn't really need to have an original trauma. What I think we do is that by writing the experience, we make it. Do you understand? It may well be that there is something there, but perhaps it's not our own past. For instance, the relevance that the Shoah has taken in my life and is completely unrelated to my biography. Mm-hmm. You understand? It's really something that is here for all of us in history, and it's been by writing and rewriting and reading it that it has become the fabric of what we carry with us as the possible failure of our society, of being a society. And this has become so central, not because it's something that has happened. This has to do with gender, with race. It is the fact that by writing it, we explore it and we think it. And even if you're not writing about that, even if you're writing about something that may appear like another element, and you may well know that you're actually translating in the very original etymological meaning, I hope, is it transfer, is to take across. You're taking it across, not only linguistically, but because you're creating a completely different scene where your character are actually acted and spoken by that thing. Do you understand? Right? So the source is not so much something that we mystically achieve and acquire and say, oh, I found. No, the source is the running. The source is the fact that you are writing, that you are living, that you can talk, that you can love, that you feel that you're alive, that this is happening, you see. And in a way, the problem I have is that I cannot handle this material without turning back. But hopefully, by turning back, there is no back. You understand what I mean? Hopefully, I can be rid of this intellectual attitude that I have that perhaps come from my European upbringing, history and so on, that I need to say, what am I writing about? But the real thing is that once I'm writing, once it is running, everything can be part of it. Calvino does I think, not a particularly beautiful short story, but really a virtuoso piece by pretending to be a shell. Do you remember? Nella Spirale, in Cosmicomiche, he writes his own autobiography as being a shell. Millions of years attempting to become this form, you see. And obviously that is nothing to do with experience. It's the writing that makes it. Once it's into that, you can be anything, a man, a woman. I think, I don't want to be, perhaps I'm sexist, but I think that my own gender is so complicated that I would certainly not choose or side with one or the other in my writing. I mean, I already have to deal with it in my real life. That's bad enough. It's bad enough, but when I write it, if I have a female voice, the most beautiful thing, the answer to this is Ulysses, the fact that you begin with Bloom being the adult male, and then as you go along in the last chapter before Molly has become a young man, and he calls the evening, and through the evening he becomes Molly. I mean, that's and it's a fantastic female voice, Molly.
Can I just say one thing about Molly? Sorry,
yes, no, I finished.
I beg your pardon.
We're always in the middle.
It's true. One thing about Molly that has to do with language and translation. Are there any native Irish speakers here? Because it's my understanding, I have a couple of Irish grandchildren, and I'm learning from their schooling. But there isn't, like a lot of languages, Irish has no words for yes and for no. And actually, if you think about talking English with Irish people, very often, if you ask them something and they want to acquiesce, they say things like, to be sure, or I agree with you, or whatever else. They don't just say yes. And even less often do they actually say no, trying to pin them down. Anyway, and Molly says yes all the way through. And it seems to me that Joyce, who of course was fluent in Irish, his father was an Irish linguist, was very, very well aware that this was a transgressive word, not only because of what Molly was doing and the time at which she was doing it, but because she was saying over and over again a word that couldn't be said before. And this is just my personal hang-up. I don't have any great theories about it. But anyway, I'm glad you brought her into it. And also the fact that I suspect that Freud was probably a much better novelist than he was a psychoanalyst. But that's another story.
I agree on that. Can I ask you something to the three of you, really? Because it's a question about the differences between writing and translating, I guess. And you're all writers and translators. And this question comes from, what you've said and also what was said in the previous session. I was just thinking how it seems to me that the act of translating, in the meaning of, trying to make sense of the word and carving images into clouds, which is a very beautiful image, and the act of looking for a source, so writing as well, are a response to basic human needs. And I was thinking, the act of listening, receptive listening, and observing are obviously essential to these two acts. do you think the act of listening is different for a writer than it is for a translator? Because it seems to me that it is still, that listening in looking for a source in the act of original writing, but also the same perceptive listening to the text in the case of the translator. Do you think it's a different listening?
I just wonder whether it's an Anglophone thing, this difference between a translator and a writer. As I
Well,
said, in Hungary, practically all the writers were translators.
But so I'm not saying that they should be two different people. Obviously, they can do exactly the same thing at the same time. I'm just curious if you think.
Well, I'm just pointing out why I think that there's a perception here, and there's an actual practice here, that most of the people who do the translating are not primarily known for their writing, whereas there are cultures in which most of the people who do the translating are known for their writing.
Yeah.
As to if I'm translating a poem, it's very similar to writing a poem. I'm looking for a poem. But of course I have a lot of the materials there to hand. So you're trying to discover the poem in that material. And the rest of that goes on to suggest that some of that answer may be formal, not in the sense of imitation formal, but it may be as much to do with manner of speaking as to do with specifics of diction and so on. I suppose much the same with a novel, really. I don't know whether it's different if you're translating novels, and whether it's different for a poet to be translating novels or to a fiction writer translating novels. I kind of translate sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph, and I kind of feeling it almost as I would do, almost exactly the same as I would do a poem, really. So it's the language which I think, does this language work? Is this language holding something?
For me, I think a lot of it is about finding the narrative voice, and I guess an author finds it most often within themselves, and you like to think if you're a translator you find it most often within the text. And I've decided that that's really paramount, and partly it was learning through teaching, because I just out of curiosity really, I took paragraphs from the first chapter of books by an Angolan, a Brazilian, and a Portuguese author, obviously all writing in the same language. And this was about context versus content. And each of them contained descriptions of place. And I asked everybody in the class to tell me, obviously I didn't tell them who the authors were, but to tell me which of these three zones, continents, they thought the story was taking place in. And it was completely hit and miss, despite them being descriptions of place and all that we've been talking about, how important it is to acculturate and to understand the context of a book. It was absolutely happenstance whether they thought it was Portugal, Angola or Brazil. And I mean, what would have been much more revealing had they read more widely, and that's another point. It's not just listening to the voice, it's reading what the voice is saying on the page, and Translator is truly a text's closest reader. They would have recognized Saramago from Rosa Mendes, from Paulo Coelho, God help us, I would have thought. But no, it was still equal thirds.
I have not been a particularly good translator, I'm afraid, and I stopped 20 years ago. So because it takes so much energy and so much strength, and I hope Doug will not hate me after he's undertaken the second novel. Because I hope he will bear with me.
Yours will be the last.
That's a compliment.
Yeah. No, it's so hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard that.
As a writer, do you think that listening
is important?
Very important to you? Or?
I think a beautiful answer would be yes.
But I want a true answer.
I don't think I fear that I'm not a very good listener. I have to confess.
Depends what it is you're listening to.
Yeah.
And to whom you're listening.
Well, I think in a way the beautiful answer is the right answer in many ways. You're listening to the language. You're not there isn't, if you like, another side through it. You get vague ideas as to what Saramago, whoever it is, you think sounds like. But as you're writing, you are actually listening just very intently. You're essentially just very aware of what is passing out through your fingers.
Yes, and it's true that in language what happens is timeless, but when I say I'm not a very good listener, I think that I'm very interested in what is said.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm a bit elliptical in conversation. This is terrible, I know. I mean, sometimes I because you get into this habit when you're writing that you're creating a scene and something has to happen and he comes in and they say blah, blah, blah. And in real life, it's not like
Real
that.
life doesn't keep up with
Doesn't keep up with this rhythm.
Yeah.
And it's very arrogant to think that real life should keep up with your rhythm. I am very aware of that. But so I would agree. You listen to the language because the language has such a broad conversation of all the characters you met in reading, of all the people you've met, stories you've heard, things that may be hidden in the language, even if nobody's ever expressed them or you don't know where they come from. And then you start listening to this conversation and you can't keep up because everybody's talking at the same. But unfortunately, I think this has been an obstacle in my real life.
Of the cacophony, I think I'm almost in favour of going towards Jonathan's silence, though I must admit that, sometimes with José Saramago, because he was such a lovely man and because I went and stayed with him and his wife on Lanzarote, where they used to live, when there were passages of him shouting at God, which he does in most of the books at some point or other, I would always hear his voice yelling at the dogs. God, dog. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't know what it does to your words, your vocabulary checks, but there you go. Yeah.
I was just going to say, listening to this conversation, I'm getting more and more confused as we go along. It seems to me that as writers, you're taking refuge in a very, very abstract kind of formalism. That at the end of the day, there is an essence called language, and that there is some kind of authenticity about it that you recognise. I mean, I was struck by Enrico, the comment that you made about Jacob and Esau. I mean, yes, there are certain kinds of statements that you cannot retract because they're performative.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Except, of course, that you have to believe. I mean, if you believe in blessing, then you can't unbless. But if, like myself, you're a double-dyed atheist, I'll change my mind the next minute. And it doesn't matter to me. If you promise something and the situations arise.
Yes, let's keep to the promise.
Yes, now that is a performative. Yes, I do. It means I've performed it. Now, if I go out of the room, come back and say, no, I don't, then we have a very, very different kind of relationship with each other. And language is doing this all the time. And it seems to me that what's missing when one starts to formalize language is the kind of cultural content, the cultural expectation. Very often when I listen to somebody, I hear my own voice, but I don't think of them as the other. I might think of them as the Lacanian other.
Right.
That's a different proposition.
Yeah.
And that would give me a real problem if I were to sit down and think about it, because I would then be thinking in terms of demand. But I mean, everything that you say, there seems to be right at the bottom of it, what drives you all is desire. There is the desire for something that you will never achieve, except, of course, when you die, because that's when desire stops.
Yes.
But isn't that what drives everybody?
Pardon? Yeah, but
motivation, desire, aspiration, I don't know what.
Particularly in relation to writers, because I mean, Sarah was saying in the last session that she found writing therapeutic. And I wanted to ask, what is the sin for which you think writing is an expiation? Because I don't recognise that. I mean, I don't write fictionally in that sense.
Right.
But I do write fictionally because there's a sense in which every academic makes it up as they go along.
Yes.
No wonder you're confused, John.
But these I mean, they're
No,
serious
therapy
questions,
and absolution are
serious
completely
political
different things.
questions.
No, I mean, therapy is a way, I don't know, I can't speak for Sarah, but I would have thought what we all do to some extent is trying to make sense of the world
There are two interesting
and give it a
metaphors.
shape.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of faith, right? One performs an act of faith, one interprets through an act of faith. One starts out on the whole project through an act of faith. Because you cannot prove that what you are seeking to achieve is what you've actually achieved. So you're setting out on this set of faith. And I would maybe quarrel with the notion of separating form from some other kind of essence. Certainly, in far as poetry goes, form is a quality of voice. It is not a superstructure. It is not a piece of decoration. It is the way somebody moves. I remember the first time I met Michael Hoffman, and I think Michael practically clicked his heels. And I think that's something which is there. I don't want to transfer this too literally across, but there is in fact a set of mannerisms which is a quality of voice, which is the way that the writer is addressing whoever the figure is, the imagined figure to whom the poem is addressed. Now that manner may vary culturally from one to the other. And in fact, what this thing would have gone on to say is that one year when I was judging actually with Susan, about 2 or 3 years ago, I think, and we gave the first prize to a translation of a very famous passage from Dante,
So Spender, the Stephen Spender.
The Stephen Spender, yeah. And what the poet had done, a young poet called Paul Batchel, he completely changed the form. It was still form. And the very interesting thing was that he understood that there was a kind of formal approach, a formal address. It need not be exactly the same formal address, but that if you completely detached it from that sense of, if you like, shapeliness, then you are also maybe straying too far from the importance of the meaning.
Can I try and give a short answer as well?
Yeah,
because
and then perhaps we can continue in the final discussion.
Yes, but right, I'll give you a very short answer and very factual. I don't eschew from the idealization and from the problem. And the answer is the episode that Loredana recalled before of the cave and Plato. When you go and read that page, it begins with Plato remembering Socrates going against the city and he doesn't name him, but we know because we know the history of it. And the whole idealization progress that you find through the philosophy of Plato is a way of reacting to an historical échec. You see, you've been cornered. You were following good for nothing who would take all the young aristocrats in Athens to question everything they had around, physics, rhetorics, whatever. You've been going after this man. He was slanderously imprisoned and executed, and you've been left with his legacy. That the man who was right, the man who was and challenged the city, was undone by treason, by Mileto, by some very, very minor characters, because his opponents do not even dare to challenge him in the trial. They send minor figures to do that. Now, the whole process of writing is a bit like, or at least for me, is a bit like that. I feel that there is an historical tragedy behind me. I mentioned the Shoah, but it's also the Punic War. It's also Julius Caesar. He's wherever I look. It's an earthquake in Japan. Whatever happens, I feel this is what we're dealing with is our vulnerability and how essentially the history of human beings has been an attempt to react to this ruin. And the process of writing is the idealization, is the fact that you react. You're not just grieving and mourning. You're reacting, you're imagining, you're creating, you keep living. So, yes, desire and imperfections, because in these desires that we are doomed to get it wrong. But at the same time, this is what when I do it, I'm alive. And I know that the other attitude for me is saying, oh, it's all over. It's you know what human beings are. We've been defeated, and so on. We've been defeated as a generation. Italy is a terrible country, and this and that. And then you're just dead because you have accepted this that is true. But I think the creative process, the beautiful essay by Elsa Morante, Pro e contro la bomba atomica, as long as there is a poet, that bomb will take 20 seconds more to explode.
The poet and the translator. Thank you so much for our speakers. Thank you.